They were told the horrors they would face would be unimaginable. Prisoners arriving at Nazi concentration camps during World War II had no idea how horrific their experience would truly be. The gates of these camps were marked by a chilling silence, interrupted only by the sounds of the unforgiving screams and the heavy steps of soldiers marching through the barbed wire fences. The life that awaited those unlucky enough to be detained was nothing short of a nightmare, a place where life was reduced to survival, where brutality and starvation were daily companions. For many, just stepping foot inside these camps meant the beginning of their end. Inside, a suffocating darkness filled the air, one that came not just from the absence of light, but from the suffering of thousands. Prisoners lived in filthy conditions, working tirelessly, with little to no food or water. They were stripped of their humanity, reduced to mere tools for forced labor. This was a place where cruelty was the currency of power, and survival depended not on strength, but on the ability to endure the unimaginable. But amid all of this horror, there was something even darker, something so grotesque it would make the cruelty of the camps seem almost secondary. And that was the creation of soap from human fat. In 1942, Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, became infamous for a truly ghastly practice. It was here that the Nazis decided to turn their human victims into commodities in a way no one could have imagined. The camp, already known for its inhumane conditions, became the site of a chilling operation, soap made from the fat of those who died in the camp. Prisoners who were worked to death, starved, or killed in the countless medical experiments were harvested for their fat. This fat, a byproduct of the murder of innocent people, was then processed into soap. The soap was not just a product, it was a sickening reminder of the power the Nazis held over their victims. The camp's officials saw nothing wrong with this practice. To them, these lives were so expendable that they could be turned into something as mundane as soap, something as everyday as the cleaning of a soldier's hands. But the truth of this twisted operation remained hidden for many years, kept in the dark by the Nazi regime and by the silence that came with it. The people who had been forced into this production, the ones who witnessed it, could not speak of it. The terror that gripped their every move was a constant reminder that to speak meant death. Even after the war, the survivors who knew about the soap found themselves unable to share the truth of what they had seen. When the Allies liberated the camps in 1945, the discovery of the soap sent shockwaves across the world. The soldiers who entered Buchenwald were met not only with the stench of death, but also with an unbelievable sight: bars of soap made from human fat, sitting neatly in the same rooms where innocent people had been killed. The soap was a physical representation of the unimaginable cruelty that had taken place, a reminder of the systematic dehumanization that had occurred under Nazi rule. The discovery was so horrifying that it took the world by storm, but the true story of the soap and the lives lost in the process was only just beginning to unfold. What had been an unspeakable atrocity was now being told, and as the world faced the truth, it realized just how dark the history of these camps had been. This story wasn't just about the soap. It was about the lives that had been taken, the families torn apart, and the terrifying silence that followed. It began in the darkest corners of Nazi ingenuity, where the boundaries of cruelty knew no limits. The Buchenwald concentration camp, located in Germany, became the birthplace of an atrocity so gruesome it defied belief. This camp, like many others during World War II, was known for its brutality, where thousands of innocent lives were lost to starvation, disease, and forced labor. But among the many horrors of Buchenwald, one practice stood out, a practice that turned human life into a commodity in the most horrifying way imaginable. That was the creation of soap made from human fat. The origin of this horrifying practice dates back to early 1942, when the Nazis began experimenting with ways to utilize the bodies of the people they had imprisoned. Buchenwald was not just a place for holding prisoners, but a dark site of experimentation, where SS officers thought nothing of exploiting human suffering for whatever they could gain. The camp was a hub of cruelty, and it was here that the decision was made to use the fat from the bodies of the dead for something as simple and everyday as soap. At the heart of this operation were the SS officers, particularly figures like Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald, who was notorious for his brutality. Koch and other members of the Nazi regime believed that prisoners, especially those who were either killed or died from the grueling conditions of the camp, could be used in ways that no one would ever suspect. To them, the bodies of these people were disposable, a resource to be exploited for whatever practical purposes could be imagined. The soap production was a twisted enterprise that involved the extraction of fat from the bodies of prisoners who had been worked to death or killed in various ways. The fat was then rendered down and processed into soap, a substance most commonly associated with cleanliness and hygiene. Yet, this soap was a symbol of something much darker. It was a byproduct of the extreme dehumanization that occurred within the walls of the concentration camp, a reminder that the Nazis saw no value in human life except for what they could extract from it. Prisoners, mostly Jews, who were selected to work in this operation, were forced to take part in the process, often under horrific conditions. They were subjected to cruel punishment, and many who worked in the soap factory were kept under constant threat. These individuals knew exactly what was happening, but like most victims in the camps, they had little choice but to comply. Fear ruled the lives of the prisoners, and speaking out against this atrocity would likely mean death. It was a world of pure terror, where every move was monitored and any form of resistance was crushed quickly and brutally. The soap production at Buchenwald was not an isolated event, but part of a larger system of exploitation and cruelty across Nazi concentration camps. Auschwitz, another infamous camp, also engaged in similar practices, though the details vary. But it was at Buchenwald where this dark industry took on a form that shocked the world when it was eventually discovered. The men and women who were forced to make soap from human fat were victims in the most profound sense. They were stripped of their dignity and their lives, used as tools in an experiment that no one could have imagined. The horror of this practice was not just in the act itself, but in what it represented. A regime that saw the lives of millions as expendable and would use them in whatever way suited their twisted goals. When the war ended and the world learned of the soap made from human fat, the full extent of Nazi depravity became undeniable. But for those who lived through it, the memories of what happened at Buchenwald would haunt them forever, a reminder of a dark chapter in history that no one could ever forget. The process began with death. In the world of Buchenwald, death was not an ending, but a step in an unthinkable production line. The bodies that arrived at the camp morgue were not treated with dignity or respect. They were numbers, stripped of identity, reduced to what could be taken from them. The prisoners who worked near the crematorium knew what happened next, though few could ever speak of it afterward. It was here, in the cold corners of the camp, that the process of turning human remains into soap began. The operation was carried out under the supervision of Nazi doctors and researchers who viewed these actions as scientific work. Among them was Dr. Walter Wust, a man known for his involvement in anthropological and biological studies under the Nazi regime. Though his official background was in cultural science, he became associated with the pseudo-scientific projects of the SS, where the boundaries between research and horror disappeared. The SS justified their actions as experiments in resource efficiency, claiming that the Reich should waste nothing, not even the fat of the dead. The bodies of prisoners who had died from starvation, disease, or execution were brought into the camp's medical facilities. Here, the so-called doctors dissected the corpses, removing organs, bones, and most disturbingly, the layers of fat that clung beneath the skin. It was done with precision, as if the victims were materials for study rather than human beings. The fat was then collected in containers and heated until it melted into a thick, oily liquid. The smell that filled the room was unbearable, a mix of smoke, chemicals, and something far worse that no words could describe. Prisoners forced to work there often vomited or fainted, only to be beaten awake and ordered to continue. Once the fat was rendered down, it was mixed with water, lye, and other basic ingredients used in soap making. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a simple process, but inside Buchenwald, it became an act of desecration. The SS referred to the substance coldly as RJF, initials that stood for Rein Jüdisches Fett, meaning pure Jewish fat. The very label was both a mockery and a declaration of cruelty, a way to strip the dead of their humanity even after death. The soap was boiled, poured into moulds, and left to cool. When it hardened, it looked like any ordinary bar of soap, smooth, pale, and harmless to the eye. But for those who knew its origin, it was a symbol of everything wrong with the world they were trapped in. Prisoners assigned to handle the soap never forgot the feel of it. They described it as slick, almost greasy, with a faint smell that no amount of perfume or chemical could hide. They were made to clean the camp floors and wash equipment with it, all while knowing exactly what it was made from. Some whispered prayers before touching it, terrified that using it would dishonor the dead. Others went silent, numb from too much horror to react at all. The SS doctors treated the production like a triumph of efficiency. To them, the soap was proof that the German war machine wasted nothing, but for the prisoners, it was the final insult. The same regime that had taken their freedom, their families, and their dignity now took their very bodies and turned them into products. Each bar of soap carried with it the memory of countless victims who had been denied even a burial. By the end of the war, when the Allies discovered traces of this production at Buchenwald and other camps, the world struggled to believe it. How could something so horrifying have been done in the name of science and progress? Yet the evidence spoke for itself. The soap was real, and so were the people it came from. The process, cold and methodical, revealed the true depth of Nazi cruelty, a system so devoid of humanity that even death offered no peace. They were the ones who saw everything but could say nothing. Inside Buchenwald, silence was both survival and torture. The prisoners who worked near the crematorium or in the areas where the soap was made carried a burden that would haunt them long after the war ended. They had seen the unthinkable, watched as the bodies of their friends, family, and fellow captives were stripped of their humanity and turned into something as ordinary as soap. Yet, within the barbed wire fences and watchtowers, there was no space for grief or rebellion. To speak meant death. To stay silent meant living with the unbearable knowledge of what was being done. The Jewish prisoners who were forced into these roles often faced an impossible moral conflict. They were victims themselves, starving and broken, yet ordered to take part in acts that went against everything human. Many were chosen simply because they were strong enough to work, or because they had some background that made them useful to the SS. These men and women were given tasks that tore at their sanity, cleaning the floors, carrying bodies, or tending to the cauldrons where fat was rendered down. They did what they were told, not because they agreed, but because they had no other choice. In Buchenwald, disobedience meant execution, and the SS made sure everyone knew it. Some tried to close their eyes to what was happening, but the smell, the sight, and the sounds made forgetting impossible. One prisoner later recalled how the air was thick with smoke that carried a strange sweetness, something that made his stomach turn every time he breathed. He knew what it meant, but learned to keep his expression blank, because even a flicker of emotion could draw a guard's attention. Others whispered prayers under their breath, their words swallowed by the roar of furnaces and shouted orders. They prayed not just for the dead, but for themselves, for forgiveness they weren't sure they deserved. In moments of rare rest, the prisoners spoke quietly among themselves, though their words came out heavy and hesitant. Some argued that it was better not to think about what was happening. Others said that silence was the greatest sin of all. But even as they whispered, fear pressed down on them like the walls of the camp itself. The SS officers had ears everywhere, and rumors of executions for unnecessary talk spread quickly. The prisoners knew that to survive, they had to bury their emotions deep, deeper than the graves that surrounded them. Over time, even horror became routine. The prisoners stopped reacting to what they saw. A body was just another task, another step in the daily work that never ended. This numbness was not cruelty but defense. It was the only way to keep from breaking completely. Still, at night, when the camp finally quieted and the guards' footsteps faded, the silence returned in a different form. It was then that the memories came rushing back. Some wept quietly into their blankets. Others stared at the ceiling, afraid to close their eyes. The thought that they had helped, even unwillingly, in such acts of desecration filled them with shame that no amount of time could erase. When the war ended and the survivors were freed, few could bring themselves to speak about what they had seen. Even among fellow survivors, the topic was avoided, too heavy to name. The guilt of having survived, of having played any part in the machinery of death, haunted them for the rest of their lives. They were witnesses to something so grotesque that words failed them, and so, for many, silence became their only refuge. In the years that followed, as people spoke of gas chambers and mass graves, the story of the soap was rarely told, not because it wasn't true, but because those who knew the truth could not bear to say it aloud. The silence that began inside the camps lingered long after liberation, carried like a shadow by those who had seen the unspeakable and lived to remember. When the Allied soldiers marched through the gates of the concentration camps in the spring of 1945, they expected to find horror, but not like this. They had heard whispers of starvation, of executions, of gas chambers, but nothing could prepare them for what they found stacked neatly in boxes beside the crematoriums. Bars of soap, pale and ordinary looking, but marked with strange symbols and initials. At first, the soldiers thought little of it. Soap was common in military and medical facilities. But as they began to hear the stories from survivors, the truth started to form, a truth that would shake the world. In the camp of Buchenwald, as American troops moved through the wreckage, the survivors tried to explain what they had seen. Through trembling voices and broken translation, they told the soldiers that the soap had been made from human fat. The Americans hesitated to believe it. The idea seemed too grotesque, too unreal to be true. Yet the evidence was there, in the rooms still smelling of smoke and decay. Jars labelled with coded notes, remains of fat mixed with lye, and in some places, small bars stamped with the letters RJF. The initials stood for Rein Jüdisches Fett, pure Jewish fat. When the Soviet troops entered Auschwitz and Dachau, they found similar traces. The Red Army officers were horrified, taking samples and photographing everything. The images were sent to Moscow, where officials struggled to process the enormity of what they were seeing. To them, It was the clearest symbol of Nazi depravity. The Nazis had not only murdered millions, they had turned their victims into objects. The Soviets wasted no time in making the discovery public, releasing reports that spoke of human soap as one of the ultimate crimes of the war. In America and Britain, newspapers printed the story almost immediately. Headlines called it "the soap from the dead." Readers across the world recoiled in disbelief. The thought that human beings could be turned into cleaning products was beyond comprehension. Journalists described the bars as evidence of a civilization that had lost its soul. In some places, people refused to believe it altogether, assuming it was Allied propaganda meant to demonize Germany. But for those who had seen it with their own eyes, there was no denying what the camps had revealed. The Nuremberg trials, held later in 1945, brought these reports into the courtroom. Witnesses testified about the soap production, including former prisoners who had worked near the crematoriums. Samples were presented as evidence. The judges and prosecutors were stunned into silence. Even among a sea of crimes, mass murder, torture, genocide, the soap scandal stood out as something uniquely horrifying. It was not a crime of necessity, but one of cruelty and arrogance. Proof of how far humanity had fallen under Nazi rule. American soldiers who had liberated the camps later wrote home about what they had found. Some said the smell of the camp kitchens haunted them for years. Others said they could never look at a bar of soap the same way again. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We came to bring freedom, but we found ghosts instead, ghosts that had been turned into things." The world's reaction was swift and emotional. There were calls for vengeance, for justice, and for remembrance. Museums and memorials began collecting artifacts from the camps, including the bars of soap, which were placed behind glass for future generations to see. Some questioned whether displaying such things was too disturbing, but others argued that the world needed to face the truth in all its ugliness. The scandal surrounding the soap became one of the defining images of Nazi cruelty. It symbolized a system that viewed human life as expendable and even useful after death. For many, it was the ultimate proof that the war had not just been about land or power, but about the soul of humanity itself. When the last camp was liberated and the survivors walked free, they carried with them the memory of those who had been turned into dust and soap, a reminder that even after death, the victims were denied peace. When the war ended and the Nazi camps were exposed to the world, the horror of what had happened inside them spread like wildfire. The soap, made from human fat, became one of the most shocking discoveries of all, but almost immediately the men responsible began to deny everything. The SS leadership, fearing what the truth would mean, moved quickly to erase evidence and silence anyone who could speak. Their goal was simple: to make the world believe that the soap had never existed, that it was all a lie crafted by the victors to tarnish Germany's name. At the center of this effort was Karl Otto Koch, the infamous commandant of Buchenwald, whose reign of terror had defined the camp's cruelty. Koch was already known for his brutality, but after the liberation, his name became tied to the soap scandal. Witnesses claimed that the production of soap had taken place under his command, but when interrogated, Koch denied everything. He insisted that the rumors were nothing more than wartime propaganda, stories invented to make the Nazis appear more monstrous than they really were. His words were cold and calculated, spoken like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Koch was not alone in his denial. Many SS officers, scientists, and camp administrators echoed the same claims. They argued that the Allies had misunderstood what they found, that the fat and materials discovered in Buchenwald were part of medical experiments or attempts to create synthetic soap for wartime shortages. In their reports, they used scientific jargon to twist the narrative, making it sound as though everything that happened was a legitimate experiment, not an act of horror. To the outside world, they wanted to appear as patriots serving their country, not murderers exploiting the dead. Behind closed doors, however, the SS worked to destroy whatever traces remained. Documents were burned, equipment dismantled, and anyone who might talk was silenced. Some prisoners who had witnessed the soap production mysteriously disappeared during the final months of the war, likely executed under orders from their captors. Others were forced to sign statements claiming they had no knowledge of such practices. The goal was to rewrite history before it could even be told. As Allied investigators tried to piece together what had truly happened, they faced a wall of deceit. The Nazis were masters of manipulation, and their propaganda machine quickly went to work. Newspapers, sympathetic to the fallen regime, published articles calling the soap story a fabrication. Pamphlets circulated claiming that the Allies had invented the story to stir hatred against Germany. Even among the general public, some began to question whether the soap really existed or if it had been exaggerated. This confusion served the Nazis well. They knew that doubt was almost as powerful as denial. In the Nuremberg trials, where the atrocities of the war were laid bare before the world, the subject of the soap came up again. Witnesses testified about what they had seen, and samples were presented as evidence, yet the defense lawyers pounced on every uncertainty. They argued that the quantities of soap found were too small, that no industrial-scale production had occurred. They painted the story as myth, born from chaos and fear. For many, it was easier to believe the denials than to confront a truth so horrifying. Karl Otto Koch himself would not live to see the outcome. Accused of corruption and murder even by his own people, he was executed by the SS in 1945, before the Allies could put him on trial. His death closed the mouth of one of the key figures who might have confirmed the truth. The denials, however, did not die with him. They continued to echo through the years, shaping how the story of Buchenwald and the soap scandal would be remembered. The world was left with fragments, witness accounts, scattered evidence, and a silence that felt deliberate. The Nazis had turned denial into their final weapon, one meant to bury their crimes beneath confusion. But for those who had seen the soap with their own eyes, no propaganda could erase what they knew. The truth, though contested, would never fully disappear. When the war ended in 1945, the gates of the camps opened, but freedom did not erase the scars left behind. The survivors of Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and other concentration camps stepped into a world that could never understand what they had endured. They were alive, but they were not the same. The war had taken everything from them: families, homes, faith, and even their sense of being human. Many had spent years surrounded by death and cruelty, and now they faced the impossible task of learning how to live again. The survivors were scattered across ruined cities and refugee camps, many too weak to walk or speak. They were given medical care, food, and clothing, but there was no medicine for the memories that haunted them. At night, they woke screaming, seeing once again the flames of the crematoriums and the faces of those who never made it out. Some could not sleep at all, afraid that closing their eyes would take them back to the camps. For many, the war did not end in liberation. It simply changed shape. The fences were gone, but the memories became the new prison walls. Among the survivors, there was one subject almost no one dared to talk about: the soap. Those who had seen the process with their own eyes carried a secret that burned inside them. They had watched their fellow prisoners turned into something meant to clean, something used casually in kitchens and barracks. The shame of it was unbearable. To speak of it felt like betraying the dead, yet to remain silent felt like betraying the truth. So most said nothing. When they were asked about life in the camps, they spoke of hunger, of beatings, of labor, but rarely of the soap. It was too much, too gruesome, too heavy to put into words. Some survivors tried to rebuild their lives in their home countries, while others emigrated to places like the United States, Canada, and Israel. They found jobs, started families, and did everything they could to forget. But forgetting was impossible. In quiet moments, a smell, a sound, or even the sight of a bar of soap could bring everything back. For many, cleanliness itself became unbearable. Some refused to use soap for years, choosing instead to wash with plain water. Others could not explain to their children why they froze when they saw soap on a store shelf. The trauma lived in the smallest details. Psychologists who later studied the survivors described their silence as both protection and punishment. They had survived something the world could barely imagine, but in surviving, they carried the burden of memory alone. For those who had worked near the crematoriums or had been forced to assist in the soap production, the guilt was overwhelming. They knew they had no choice, but the thought that they had been part of something so monstrous haunted them until their final days. Some confided in priests or rabbis, seeking forgiveness, but even spiritual comfort could not erase what they had seen. As the years passed, the survivors began to age, and many took their stories to the grave. It was not because they wanted to hide the truth, but because speaking it aloud brought the pain back to life. They had spent their post-war years building normal lives, yet beneath the surface, the memories of Buchenwald never faded. The world saw them as symbols of endurance, but inside, they carried a quiet agony that words could never express. For the rest of their lives, the survivors lived with two kinds of silence: the one the Nazis forced upon them, and the one they chose themselves. Between those silences lay the truth of what had happened, a truth too heavy to speak, but too real to forget. In the years after the war, the bars of soap found in the camps became more than physical evidence. They became symbols of the darkest depths of human cruelty. To those who had lived through the Holocaust, the soap represented everything that had been stolen from them: their dignity, their humanity, their right to be remembered as people rather than as objects. As the world tried to rebuild, the story of the soap began to spread, whispered first among survivors and later written into history books. It was a story so disturbing that many refused to believe it. Yet for others, it became a grim reminder of how far mankind had fallen. At Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and other sites of mass death, the soap became a relic of horror. Soldiers had collected samples during liberation, storing them away as proof of what they had witnessed. Over time, these pieces found their way into museums, memorials, and archives. The Buchenwald Memorial, established in 1958, became one of the first places to address this part of history. Visitors could walk the same grounds where the prisoners once lived and died, standing in silence before the exhibits that displayed what remained of the camp's atrocities. Among the uniforms, photographs, and ashes, there were also bars of soap, sealed behind glass. Some saw them as sacred evidence, others as unbearable reminders of desecration. The story of the soap divided historians and survivors alike. Some argued that displaying it honored the truth, that the world needed to see every detail of Nazi barbarity. Others believed it went too far, that to show the soap was to continue stripping away the humanity of those who had already suffered enough. The question was painful and deeply personal. How could anyone remember the victims with dignity when even their bodies had been turned into things? For decades, the soap became a haunting image in Holocaust education. Teachers and museum guides spoke of it carefully, their voices heavy with the weight of history. Some survivors refused to look at it, saying it felt wrong to place such objects in glass cases for strangers to stare at. Others said it was necessary, that people needed to be shocked, because only through shock would they truly understand the evil that had taken place. There was no right answer, only the shared understanding that the story of the soap could never be separated from the story of the Holocaust itself. In later years, the soap became a topic of ethical debate among scholars and historians. As more research emerged, questions arose about how much soap had truly been made and how widely it had been distributed. But even when the numbers were uncertain, the meaning was not. Whether it was 1 bar or 1,000, the act itself was real, and its legacy could not be erased. The soap symbolized a line that humanity should never cross again. For the families of survivors, the legacy of the soap was deeply personal. It was not just about history, it was about memory. Many kept the story alive within their homes, teaching their children and grandchildren what had happened so that silence would not take root again. For them, remembrance was a duty, a way to give back the voices that had been taken. Today, when visitors walk through Holocaust memorials, the story of the soap still lingers in the air. It is not spoken loudly, but it is felt. It reminds everyone who stands there that cruelty can hide in the ordinary, that something as simple as soap can carry the weight of millions of lives. The soap is no longer just a relic of war. It is a symbol of remembrance and warning, a small, silent object that forces the world to look into the mirror of its own history and ask how such a thing could have ever happened. In the years that came after the war, silence settled like dust over the memories of the camps. Survivors built new lives in quiet towns and crowded cities, carrying within them stories they could not tell. They married, raised families, and tried to smile, but deep inside, the memories of what they had seen remained locked away. The soap was one of those memories, one that few ever dared to speak of. To say it aloud would bring back the smell, the faces, the fear. For many, silence became a way to survive in a world that did not want to hear. Those who had been at Buchenwald or Auschwitz and had seen the soap with their own eyes carried a different kind of wound. It was not just the pain of losing family or friends, but the shame of knowing what had been done to them after death. The thought that their loved ones had been turned into something so ordinary, so grotesque, was unbearable. Some survivors felt that speaking of it would dishonor the dead, while others believed no one would believe them. The world already struggled to grasp the scale of the camps. To speak of soap made from human fat sounded impossible, like a nightmare too far removed from reason. Survivors' guilt haunted them. Many asked themselves why they had lived when so many others had not. Those who had worked near the crematoriums or been forced to handle the soap carried that guilt even deeper. They knew they had no choice, but the memory of what their hands had touched burned inside them. They could not escape the feeling that survival had come at a cost they could never repay. In the rare moments when they tried to talk about it, they often stopped mid-sentence, the words catching in their throats. The silence that followed said more than words ever could. In the 1950s and 60s, as the world began to move forward and rebuild, many survivors stayed quiet. Some wanted to protect their children from the horrors they had known. Others felt that society did not want to listen. When they did speak of the camps, they spoke of hunger, of work, of liberation, but never of the soap. That detail stayed buried, a private horror carried from one sleepless night to the next. Psychologists who later studied Holocaust survivors often found that many of them suffered from what they called invisible grief, a pain too deep to express and too heavy to forget. In Jewish communities around the world, whispers of the soap story passed between families. Some refused to use certain brands, believing they might have once contained traces of human fat. Others washed their hands quickly, as if the act itself carried a memory. The Holocaust had ended, but its shadow lingered in everyday gestures. Even something as small as a bar of soap could awaken decades of sorrow. As the survivors grew older, their silence took on a different weight. Some began to realize that by not speaking, they were allowing parts of history to fade. A few, in their final years, broke their silence, giving interviews or writing memoirs that mentioned the soap. Their voices trembled as they spoke, but they wanted the truth remembered. They wanted the next generation to understand that silence, while once a shield, could also become a prison. For most, though, the soap remained an unspoken memory, something that lived only in their minds. They had spent too many years trying to forget, yet forgetting was impossible. The silence that followed the war was not peace, but a fragile barrier between the living and the ghosts they carried within them. And though the survivors eventually found ways to smile again, deep down they knew that part of them had been left behind in the camps, among the ashes, the screams, and the soap that no one wanted to remember. Time moved forward, but the shadow of the camps never truly faded. The survivors aged, their voices grew weaker, and the world around them changed. Yet the story of Buchenwald and the soap made from human fat still lingers like a scar across history, too dark to forget, too painful to fully face. The world promised never again, but promises fade when memory grows quiet. What remains now is the responsibility of remembrance, the duty to confront what humanity once became, and to understand that forgetting is the first step toward repeating the same mistakes. The story of the soap was more than just evidence of cruelty. It became a mirror, showing what happens when human life is reduced to nothing but material. In the camps, people were stripped of their names, their faith, and their dignity. They were turned into numbers, into bodies, into ash. The soap was the final insult, the moment when even death was not allowed to bring peace. It showed the world the depth of what hate can create, a warning carved in the most grotesque way possible. As the decades passed, museums and memorials were built across Europe, from Buchenwald to Auschwitz and beyond. The stories of the victims were collected, preserved in photographs, letters, and the testimonies of those who survived. Yet even among all these records, the story of the soap remained one of the hardest to speak about. It was so disturbing that some historians questioned it, while others fought to make sure it was never erased. The truth, as always, lived in between, supported by evidence, shaped by memory, and burdened by disbelief. For the families of survivors, the legacy did not end with liberation. The children and grandchildren of those who lived through the camps grew up in the shadow of that silence. They saw the pain in their parents' eyes, the way their voices changed when asked about the war. Some learned the truth only later, through old letters or interviews recorded for archives. Many described feeling the weight of a trauma they had never personally experienced, a grief passed down like an inheritance. The story of the soap was not just a chapter in history, it was a wound that stretched across generations. In schools and memorials, the story is now taught carefully. Teachers speak about the Holocaust not as something distant, but as a reflection of what people are capable of when hatred becomes law and compassion disappears. The soap, they explain, is not only about the camps, but about the dangers of forgetting that people are people, no matter their race, religion, or origin. To remember the soap is to remember the thin line that separates civilization from cruelty. As the last survivors leave this world, their absence creates a silence that must be filled with truth. Their stories are now written in stone, in film, and in memory, so that those who come after will understand what happens when power is left unchecked. The truth is not easy to carry. It never was. But history demands it. The soap of Buchenwald stands as a symbol of both horror and warning. It reminds the living that the past is never truly gone, that the smallest acts of cruelty can grow into something monstrous if left unchallenged. The story is not just about the dead, it is about the living and the choices they make. The world may wish to move on, to bury its shame beneath new wars and new distractions, but the truth remains, waiting to be acknowledged. History cannot be forgiven, but it can be remembered, and in remembrance there is strength. The bars of soap that once symbolized the depths of evil now serve as quiet teachers, reminding humanity of what it must never allow again. The story of Buchenwald is not only about what was lost, but about what must never be lost again. The courage to face the truth, no matter how terrible it is.